Welcome to the Virginia is for Laughers podcast, brought to you by X2 Comedy. If you're looking to get more out of your Shenandoah Valley experience, then this is the podcast for you. You'll meet interesting people, musicians, and comedians that perform here and find out more about what you can do and see. Whether you live here or plan to visit, listen to explore what makes our unique slice of heaven. Now here's your host, Don Davis Womack.
Hello, Laughers. Today we dive into the lives and legacies of influential figures who have shaped history. Today we have the privilege of speaking with Andrew Phillips, the curator and director of museum operations at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library in Staunton, Virginia. With a background in museum studies and a passion for preserving and sharing history, Andrew brings a wealth of knowledge and insight into the life and times of Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States. He previously worked in collections at Wing Luke Asian Museum in Seattle, Washington, and the Fairfax Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. He received his BA in History and Civil War Era Studies from Gettysburg College and an MA in Museum Studies from the University of Washington. At the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Museum, you get to step into the life and times of one of America's most influential presidents. From his humble beginnings in the Shenandoah Valley to his transformative tenure in the White House, you will learn about it here. Connect with the ideals that continue to shape the world today. Engage in thought-provoking conversations with knowledgeable guides, or lose yourself in the tranquil beauty of the surrounding gardens, providing a serene backdrop for introspection and contemplation. Whether you are an ardent history enthusiast or a curious explorer, the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Museum promises an unforgettable experience. Welcome to the show, Andrew. It's great to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's delighted to be here.
It is a delight to be here. To be honest, and I shared this with you before we recorded and we were walking around, I have not been here since before the pandemic. And that's been a minute.
It has. Well, I feel like the pandemic has either greatly expanded or contracted time. So if something happened in 2019, it could have been 50 years ago or last week. I usually can't tell.
I agree with that. We're, I think, all still figuring that part out. And you were here working at the museum then during the pandemic, right?
That's right. I've been here since 2012.
Okay. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about how things look like before, during, and after the pandemic in terms of providing experiences.
Absolutely.
For the guests that come here. But I always like to start out a little bit to learn a little bit more about the guests themselves. So, Andrew, I was wondering if you could tell us more about your journey into the world of museum curation and operations in the first place. Yeah.
Well, I grew up in Northern Virginia, DC suburb. So I essentially was raised in the Smithsonian. And if I had any aptitude for science, then I would be hopefully doing the same thing, but for dinosaurs. But I also loved history. And so when I went to college, I was trying to research a way to continue that love of history and get paid for it. So I settled on museums. It seemed very natural. And my main research focus was on the Civil War and how slavery was interpreted in Civil War museums. And I ended up in grad school on the other side of the country thinking I had done too much Civil War and I wanted to get away from it for a little bit. That didn't work. I ended up doing that for my master's thesis also. But it was just a lot of fascinating topics and a really great experience in Seattle. There are a number of amazing museums. The one I worked for, the Wing Luke, is there in Seattle and is, if your listeners are familiar with the Tenement Museum in New York, it's a version of that, but focused on the Asian Pacific Islander experience as they were immigrating to the west coast of the U.S. So that was a wonderful experience for me. And then I came back to the East Coast because this is where all my friends were, and was doing some work around the Civil War 150th, the sesquicentennial, back in mostly 2010 and 11. And I enjoyed that greatly, but couldn't find health insurance doing that. So I was looking for a full-time museum job and was very lucky, really incredibly lucky to get this one. And I think it worked out well because we interpret here on our campus the home where Woodrow Wilson was born. We think of him as a more modern president, but he's born before the Civil War. He is the last U.S. president to be born in a home where there are enslaved people living and working. And so we were trying to do a better job of telling their stories, not just the story of a baby who happened to be here. And so I think that was part of it. But it meant I had to learn a lot about World War I really quickly.
I bet. How did you find out about this position when you were on the West Coast? How does one find?
By that time, I had moved back to Northern Virginia.
Okay.
I was working at the Fairfax Museum for a couple of years and really enjoyed it. We had the reenactment of the Battle of Fairfax, which calling it a battle is a very generous thing to do. It was a handful of cavalrymen running through the city back and forth right before the real battles, things like First Manassas. But it was, while it was a great experience, it was one that I wanted to be able to find one that I could do it full time. And this one, I love the Shenandoah Valley. It's a beautiful place. Mm-hmm. I wanted to stay in the area, in the broader area. I was casting a wide net for sure when I was sending out resumes, but I was delighted when this is the one that I got.
Yeah, we're fortunate to have you here for sure.
Kind of you to say.
Well, I think so. I was really impressed with some things that you showed me around there. I'm curious, when did you know in your youth that you loved history? Do you remember the moment?
I have a father who did the stereotypical thing of dragging his children to museums and Civil War battlefields. Or I should say, I have a father who dragged us to Civil War battlefields and a mother who dragged us to museums. And
fair.
In a way, I am the traitor of the children because I actually got into the Civil War. And once I grew up, the other two, not so much. But that's okay. We love each other anyway.
I love that. And you chose to study that more specifically when you had a chance to get your education in college. What surprised you the most when you started digging into that history?
Well, I really started studying the Civil War because at Gettysburg College, we were literally surrounded by battlefield.
Right.
We couldn't escape it, no matter where we went in town. And it's not that big of a town. But the things I really delved into and that really intrigued me were the ways that we should be talking about the complexity of history. That totally worshiping and on the other hand, totally vilifying historical figures is not really helpful, because if they were saints or demons, then we can pretend that they were different. But I think it's important to talk about these people who are so influential and consequential in our history, who help to shape the world that we live in today, who help to bring about the current events that we deal with now. That understanding them as people like us is important because we can recognize where they failed and how we could do better, and where they succeeded and how we could emulate. So that was the thing that really intrigued me and that made me want to help share that with more people.
The complexity of the human being.
Yeah.
Yeah. And its impact on our history, which does have very consequential impact. And Woodrow Wilson is I think, role model of complexity. From brushing up on him a little bit, of course, you will know more than I do, having your education and experience here. As Woodrow Wilson, as we stated, is complex, he was also controversial in American history. How does the museum navigate presenting his legacy, including both his accomplishments and his feelings?
With Woodrow Wilson, there are perfectly legitimate reasons to like and to despise him. And we feel it's not our job to tell you, come and visit us. We're going to tell you about this wonderful man. Or on the other hand, to tell you about this true horror. We want to present what actually happened. We want to use his words as much as we can, so that we're not trying to justify the things he did, good or bad. We want him to have to do that. Our sort of mantra, I suppose, is consequential figure, transformational era. That this is a person who had a huge impact. And this is a time that really changed not just the country, but the world. His era is before the Civil War to just after World War I, a time of seismic changes all around the globe. primarily from the consequences of World War I, but not solely. And we are living in a world that Woodrow Wilson had a hand in making. And we want to be able to understand that so that we can understand our present time. For us, it's sort of a warts and all thing. You come, we present the history as best we can, and then you decide if he was a good or bad person, if he was a good or bad president. That's sort of our main goal.
Mm-hmm. And to speak to some of those issues, at least I was noticing and reading up and kind of talked about it a little bit as we were walking around. He had 3 daughters, right?
He did.
Yes. And so it seems like over time, if you read about him, his viewpoint on women voting sort of evolves over time in the length of his time here with us. Yet he wasn't stopping Jim Crow laws from happening. And can you talk about how you all present that to the public and inform us about that?
Well, there is, we're very lucky to work with a number of wonderful scholars all across the country. And one of them, his name is Eric Yellen. He's a professor at the University of Richmond, wrote a fantastic book, Racism in the Nation's Service, all about segregation. So a lot of focus on the Wilson era, but segregation is both before and after him. And he likes to say, and I'll paraphrase, there are times in Woodrow Wilson's career where he takes very bold stands for certain kinds of inclusion. He is the son and grandson of immigrants, and so he is far more welcoming to those primarily coming from Southern and Eastern Europe than a lot of other politicians of his time. He vetoes things like literacy laws that were targeting people coming mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. He is the first the first U.S. president who is really talking about Jewish Americans as being fully American, that not being Christian is not otherizing them, that they are just as much an American as someone coming from England who is a Protestant. And he appoints the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. He appoints Native Americans to a couple of federal posts. But at the same time, and as Dr. Yellen says, there are other times where he takes similar stances in favor of types of exclusion. And that primarily is African Americans. And it shows itself in its ugliest form, I think, in the segregation that of the federal government that was present in D.C. Before Wilson's administration, but he and his cabinet really accelerate and expand it. The Treasury Department, the Post Office, and the Department of the Navy, especially, suddenly Black civil servants and clerks who had been working with their white colleagues with no issue are suddenly have to be told that you have to use different restrooms, different cafeterias. Their offices either are in different places or they are shoved to the wall. There are some photos of the time where you can see the way that it worked. And the white clerks have their desks in the middle of the room. They're in orderly rows. All the Black clerks are shoved up against a wall with much less space. It is talked about then, and Wilson like, oh no, this is to help them, and so they don't have to compete. But in reality, it is forcing them into poorer and poorer conditions, and really is detrimental, especially to this emerging Black middle class in DC. This was federal jobs, working for the government in lots of different capacities, was a place where African Americans could find steady work that required an education. It allowed them to build economic power at the same time that they are building, in many ways, political power. And while Wilson is saying at the time even that we are not going to fire people, we're not going to be forcing them out of positions, another really important part of segregation, and one thing that we don't talk about as much, is that they started requiring photos to be included with federal job employment. When you sent in your resume, it had to include a picture. So they could very easily say, well, we're looking for a clerk. Let's just pick the white ones. And so African Americans started getting worse and worse jobs until eventually they were just working like in the commissary or in like custodial work. The amount of them getting these fairly well paying and jobs that required an education just got less and less. It was an insidious way to go about doing it. And we try to be open with it. We do not pretend that Woodrow Wilson was just a bit misguided. We talk about his racist views as being racist. Again, it's our sort of policy of warts and all for a figure like this.
I actually got quite educated just then. I did not really know the depth of and impact of all those decisions. It
was a truly terrible time. The historians call the especially the late teens and early 20s the nadir of American race relations for a good reason. It was a time when actively or passively a lot of people in the U.S. government were working to undermine the gains that had come about, especially after the Reconstruction amendments that ended slavery and that gave the vote to Black people.
Yeah, it's a tumultuous time.
Absolutely.
During Reconstruction is what they called it. Wow. Well, there's a lot to offer here in terms of history knowledge, and the museum certainly offers that to the visitors where they can journey through Woodrow Wilson's life from his humble beginnings to his transformative tenure in the White House. There are some key exhibits here and artifacts all around us. What do you see that the visitors find most intriguing and impactful to them?
Well, part of any visit to the Wilson Presidential Library is you get a guided tour of the home where he was born. We talk about his family, his older sisters, his minister father, as well as the 3 enslaved people who were living and working in the house. We want to present the whole history of that story. It's not, again, just the story of a baby. You also get to see exhibits about his whole life. We start with his birth and we recognize he just lives in Staunton for 16 months. We're milking that for all we can. But while he lived in places up and down the East Coast, you only have one birthplace. So we're okay with what we're doing.
Claim it.
But we talk about World War I. We talk about his domestic policies. We have his limousine. It is the oldest continually operated presidential car in the country. His 1919 Pierce Arrow, and also an immersive trench exhibit, so you can learn a little bit more about World War I. We try to present a comprehensive picture of this era.
Yes, and Leffers, I can testify that those were very impressive exhibits, both the limousine and the World War I trench. There's actually audible sounds from World War I that you can hear as you walk through that exhibit.
That's right. They're recordings that were made on the Western Front. We worked with the Imperial War Museum in London. They were very kind to share those with us.
Yeah. And it's not headphones or anything. You hear it as you walk through. Yeah, it's pretty exciting. And then the limo, Pierce Arrow, is a company that basically made cars, if I heard you right earlier, for the wealthiest Americans, it sounded like.
It was, the Pierce Arrow Company was kind of the Rolls Royce of that period of American history.
Yeah.
It had all the trappings that they had available at the time. So it doesn't have windshield wipers or seatbelts, but it does have an electric start and electric lighting. It had an intercom system in it. It was a $9,250 car at a time when a Model T was like $350. I mean, it was intended for the top of the market, and it did not survive the Great Depression.
No, it did not. It's a beautiful car.
We take care of it. I like to say, and I think this is only partially a joke, that we are in this town, we are in Staunton because he was born in the house that we maintain as his birthplace. But if something happened to the house, I would be in less trouble than if something happens to that car.
It's a big deal, and you have a party every year for it, too.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
It's got to have its birthday. It's going to be 105 this summer.
Okay. And what are the plans for that? Is there a big birthday
We usually
party?
have a cake. We don't smash the cake into the grill of the car. We feel like that would be inappropriate. But yeah, we have some activities, and we pull it out of the garage and let people see that it still runs. We want to show off its operationalness.
Yeah. And speaking of events too, don't you have, by the time this, I want to quantify this, Laughers, because by the time this comes out, it will have passed. He can let us know if it's going to happen again. But this weekend coming up, or next week, you have Air Force One the actual aircraft?
That is a program that's coming up next week. Unfortunately, the plane is not going to be here, but not too far from us. I think it's in Grottoes or Where's Cave or something like that. A gentleman is working to restore the very first Air Force One, which was Eisenhower's plane. And so he's going to come and talk to us about that process. But every month we have what we call our speaker series. And those are in person here in our library building or online. So you can tune in via Zoom and not have to leave the comfort of your home. But those are free programs.
Okay. What other exhibits would they find here in Artifacts?
Well, some of my favorite are in the Birthplace House. We have a map of the United States, the way that the United States thought it should look in 1846. So it's the same year that the house is built. But it has things like Texas is still claiming its republic borders that are going all the way up into what's now Wyoming. America is pretending that most of British Columbia is going to be part of the United States. But California is still Mexican, for instance. Well, there's only one Virginia. And it's really neat because it's a very large and very detailed map. And if you're living, especially in New England or the Upper South, maybe or over, maybe as far west as like Indiana, you're probably going to be able to find your town or at least your county on that map. But if you're in southern Florida or if you're west of Missouri, it gets a little bit harder unless it's a larger city. And at the time, of course, in southern Florida, there are one or two forts and a number of Seminole still living there. So it's neat to see the way that the United States evolves. The car, of course, is a huge a piece and one we all love. But another item that we have and that we try to rotate through are the paintings of Woodrow Wilson's first wife. Her name was Ellen Axon, and she was a very gifted artist as a young woman. And then later in life, she got into Impressionist landscapes. We have about 15 of her works, and we try to show them throughout the year. And I'm a big fan. And for anyone out there who is interested in becoming a curator, it means you get to decorate your office with stuff like that. So there are perks.
There are perks. They really are beautiful. I like them too. I'm a fan. Yeah. And I brought actually some key artifacts today too.
You did?
I did, of the edible variety. It's some absurdly flavorful gourmet popcorn from our sponsor, PrePOPsterous. I brought you some. What do you think about it?
It's delicious. I got maple.
Maple, another one of my favorites. I just bought some popcorn from her shop yesterday, and I told myself I would be good, and it would last a week, and it's already all gone.
Oh yeah, these are the sort of bags that you can feel very confident about, but they'll be gone within 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Very addictive, and their kernels are grown right here in the Shenandoah Valley. Their factory is 100% nut-free, and they're the Shenandoah Valley's only award-winning popcorn. That's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a perfect gift, too, for any occasion, birthdays, anniversaries, literally anything you can think of, laughers. Plus, you get a 15% discount when you use promo code LAUGH15. Just visit PrePOPsterous.com. That's PrePOPsterous.com today. And that way, you can grab some delicious popcorn when you join me on next week's episode. That is so fun. I want to talk to you more about this immersive experience in the trench exhibit. I would like for you to describe a little bit more visually what that looks like for people.
We put our trench exhibit in the basement of our building. The museum building used to be a home, a historic home, still is, I suppose, a historic home, but was built in the 1850s. And so it has a large basement that included like its boiler and a place for the coal and things. So it feels kind of dark and dank as you go in. And we felt that would be a great place to sort of help communicate what it felt like to be in the trenches of World War I. We have a trench and bunker built in that you can walk through. You can use the periscope that is peering over the top of the trench to allow them to see out, to hopefully not get shot and see what was going on up above them. But we try to talk in that exhibit about the incredible mechanization and industrial nature of that war, and the way that, I mean, basically a generation of European men were killed or wounded in it. I believe I read somewhere once that there is only a single town in England that didn't lose anyone in either World War I or World War II. I mean, it was a totalizing experience for the continent, and an end of the world scenario, especially in Belgium and northwestern France and areas on the Eastern Front. It is a war that I think in American imaginations gets overshadowed by World War II, and not unreasonably so. In World War I, it feels like the reasons for the war are more Byzantine, perhaps. It's all about alliances, and while the Germans are doing awful things, so are the British and French, so are the Russians. You can talk about it being a war for democracy, but at least at the beginning of it, the most autocratic government in Europe, the Tsar of Russia, was on the same side as the British Parliament. And in World War II, it's much easier to figure out who was the good guy and who was the bad guy.
Yeah.
And it certainly doesn't hurt that World War I and the failures of that peace process, some of which were Woodrow Wilson's, lead fairly directly into the conflict that starts just a few decades later. And so we try to talk about how World War I is not only an important event in and of itself, but it is the beginning of so much else that continues to affect the world today. As one more example, a lot of the boundaries of the modern Middle East were drawn up in that in dark rooms at the part of the Paris Peace Conference and in the treaties that come about. And that region of the world has been totally peaceful and everything's fine. So,
right, yeah, there's a lot going on. It's still unsettling at the moment as we speak. Going back in history during his presidency, though, we also saw some significant legislative achievements, particularly in the antitrust legislation and banking reform. And I had to remind myself what antitrust is, but I'm going to have you explain that to the laughers. I'm sure you'll do a better job.
Well, this is another totally foreign concept to today. A giant corporation that was controlling huge segments of its market. We don't have anything like that now. But it was Theodore Roosevelt, I think, is usually talked about as the trust buster, that he's going after these giant corporations that are controlling their markets and jacking up prices just because they can. You can't go anywhere else. But we like to say that Woodrow Wilson and the legislation passed during his presidency actually busted more trusts than TR did. But that was a huge issue especially in the election of 1912. The robber barons, these incredibly wealthy people, the earnings gap was just out of control at that time, not dissimilar to how it is today. I mean, we try to focus on a lot of the parallels between the period of Wilson's presidency, the early 1900s, and what we're living with now. The Spanish flu of 1918 and the COVID-19 pandemic are two more examples. But yeah, the Wilson comes into office on a progressive platform, and progressive meant it was a little bit different than how we mean it today. And there were both Republican and Democratic progressives, as there were Republican and Democratic conservatives. And the progressive legislation focused on the economy was in stopping this boom and bust cycle in the banks, where they kept going bankrupt and huge runs on their currency. It seemed like every 20-ish years. They wanted to be able to help farmers. They wanted to do and actually implement safety laws that would help working people, put an end to child labor, things like that. So Woodrow Wilson, when he comes into office, is making a priority a lot of those sorts of laws. And creating the Federal Reserve is one of the biggest ones that he accomplishes there at the beginning.
Yeah, that is quite remarkable. There's so much to dig into, and there's a lot more we can talk about.
This is going to be a 10-hour podcast, right?
Right. I feel like I just keep having so many questions. My next question is, Wilson's commitment to international cooperation and diplomacy led to the creation of the League of Nations. Now, I was reading somewhere where he actually started that, but then in another place where it wasn't actually a thing, it didn't happen. So I'm hoping you can clear that up for me and talk more about what this League of Nations was.
Sure. Well, Woodrow Wilson, I think one of his real lasting legacies is what we call Wilsonian internationalism. This idea that the United States has a role to play in the world, be that militarily or diplomatically or through sanctions or relief or in lots of different ways. And really starting with FDR, there's the presidents in the 30s, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover sort of step away from it a bit. But starting with FDR until today, every U.S. president to one degree or another has followed this sort of Wilsonian idea of being involved in the world. Again, in very different ways. W. Bush and Obama did it in different ways. Trump and Biden did it in different ways. But the idea that the United States can be solely dependent upon itself and, to be fair, dominating the other nations, especially below us in our hemisphere, in Central and South America, that is not really a reasonable idea amongst anyone nowadays. And so when Wilson ultimately takes the United States into World War I, when he goes to Congress in April of 1917 and requests a declaration of war against Germany, that is a huge step and a huge change for American foreign policy. Since George Washington, there had been this idea that, and a not unreasonable idea, that the Atlantic and then Pacific Oceans formed these wonderful moats that protected the New World from the conflicts of the Old. And it was certainly helped by the fact that lots of Americans had emigrated primarily from Europe to escape the wars that were going on over and over again on that continent. So when the war breaks out in 1914, a lot of people in the United States think that this is aristocrats squabbling over who knows what. They're all related anyway. Just let them deal with that themselves. That is not our problem. And it takes several years. A lot of impact on American shipping, as well as some threats that the Germans make via the Zimmerman telegram, which goes to Mexico, to really draw the United States and get the public on the side of joining World War I. And afterward, Woodrow Wilson is very much an idealist. He thinks that, the United States doesn't have any territorial ambitions here. We can come into this and act as a peacemaker and sort of dictate terms. Not surprisingly, the French and the British, especially the Italians for that matter, don't really appreciate that so much. They want there are territorial demands. There are, of course, reparations demands that they make on Germany. But one of the things that Woodrow Wilson really champions is the League of Nations, an international organization where nations will come together to diplomatically solve their problems and not ultimately go to conflict. The League is created. It's a part of the Treaty of Versailles, and Versailles is the first of the treaties with the defeated Central Powers. It's the one that's just with Germany. But the United States, there's a lot of skepticism of this idea of a League of Nations. And while the United States had been pulled into World War I, there are a lot of people who don't think that this needs to set a precedent. Just because we were a part of this one doesn't mean we need to get involved in all these other things going on in the world. We want to retreat back behind our quote unquote moats. And so there was a lot of skepticism of the League. There was a lot of resistance to it. Some of it was because people didn't like Woodrow Wilson. Some of them were worried it would infringe on America's sovereignty. And so while the League is created, the United States will never join, despite Wilson's best efforts. And the failures of the League are really studied when the UN is being put together in the last years of World War II. FDR had actually been Woodrow Wilson's Assistant Secretary of the Navy for the vast majority of the presidency. And so he admired Wilson greatly and wanted to do better at the end of his conflict. And obviously, FDR does not live to see the actual end of the war. But a lot of the groundwork is laid by him at this time. And the modern UN is built from the lessons of the failures of the League.
That's maybe why that some places it's reading as a success. It comes out of the failure.
It's a success in that it was created, but it is a failure in obviously Germany invades Poland and Italy invades Ethiopia, amongst others.
Yeah. And we have recently here at the museum, I should say you all, have celebrated the 100th anniversary of Woodrow Wilson's death just recently here in February. What do you believe are some of the most important lessons that can be drawn specifically from his life and presidency?
I think the idea of high idealism and being able to negotiate with pragmatism are a special lesson to be learned from Woodrow Wilson. This shows itself in lots of ways. When he's in Paris, he is saying these lofty ideals of let's make this the war to end all wars, and we will ensure that nothing like this will ever happen again. While Clemenceau, who is in charge of France, is like, we need to destroy Germany so that they can never attack us again. He comes across as this, Clemenceau does, as bloodthirsty, and maybe that's true, but considering the devastation of what has happened to France for the last 4 years, you can sort of see where he's coming from. He wants to make it so that Germany can never get up off of its knees. As we know from history, that does not work either. So it's the way that Wilson tries to negotiate that, I think, is a really important lesson from his time. Another is that he, in a similar vein, he has these idealistic ideas about creating a more progressive state and turning the American government into one that will work better for the people. But he is totally willing to throw African Americans under the bus when he gets any sort of resistance primarily from Southern Democrats and senators. Southern Democrats in the House and Senate when he is trying to get that legislation passed. So it's looking at Wilson as a complex historical figure and one that we can hopefully look to and do better than.
I agree with that. But none of us are perfect, are we?
No, definitely not.
Yeah. So we can learn from our imperfections as well as the imperfections in other people around us. Those are good lessons too.
Wilson certainly is one of the best examples of a president with feet of clay, or maybe feet and legs and waist of clay. I mean, he had a fair amount of clay in there. But there were things that he accomplished that continue to resonate today, good and bad. And we want to be able to understand our history so we understand where we are now.
What are some of your favorite exhibits of his life here in the museum?
I think my favorite is the Pierce Arrow. It's not just because it's a fascinating object, but you can really see in that car the evolution between the period of vehicles driven or pulled by horses and fully independent automobiles. It's got a lot of these what we might think of as archaic features, and just being able to see that transition point in history is really cool. Another is we have our final exhibit in the museum is all about the last few years of Wilson's life, from his time at the Paris Peace Conference until his death in 1924. We try to be upfront and talk openly about both victories and defeats, successes and failures. The suffrage amendment is passed, and while it nationally gives women the right to vote, it is primarily restricted to white women. Jim Crow is still very much in effect in the South. African American women are going to have just the same trouble that black men had been having trying to go to the polls at this time. The racial violence of the Red Summer in 1919 is truly terrible, as black homes and businesses across the country are targeted and a number of people are killed. The same is true of the violence around the first Red Scare, and as people, once World War I had ended, start to strike for better pay and better hours and protections from very dangerous work oftentimes. And then they are brutally suppressed by their bosses and sometimes by the state. We want to talk about this time as being both transformational and deeply relevant to issues that we still talk about today.
Oh, yeah. They're still having an impact on our entire community as a globe. Mm. Yeah. That is some deep work there. It's information to share.
We try to think of it as we're creating the trailer and not the movie. We don't want you to come and thinking, well, I'm going to read 8 books on the wall before I leave. I don't think that's anybody's idea necessarily of a good time. If you're going to read, at least be able to sit down. But we want to broach these topics to bring up this incredible history and hopefully spark some curiosity so that people want to learn more about this time.
Mm-hmm. And when they come here, they take a tour. They go to the birthplace mansion. And what else is included on the tour?
Well, you do get, as you said, a guided tour of the birthplace house. We have all of our exhibits are self-guided, so you get to explore those at your leisure. We have a gift shop, and I wouldn't be a museum professional if I didn't encourage you to visit the gift shop when you visit.
Yes, do that, Laffers.
But and we also have gardens in the back of the birthplace house. They were installed in the 1930s as these very formal gardens. Not at all what would have been there in the 1850s when the Wilsons are here. And so what we've done is taken up some of those quote unquote pleasure gardens and done archaeology. So we're trying to learn not just about the historical stories that we can get from documents, but what we find in the earth that really tells us about the daily lives of people back then.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I was walking around there. You've worked in other museums too, including the Wing Luke Asian Museum and the Fairfax Museum. How do those experiences of curating those museums differ from the Presidential Library here?
Well, it's a lot of the basics are the same. I care for the same sort of objects in a lot of ways. If you have an antique object that's made out of wood or leather, you care for it if it came from China or if it came from the United States. At the same time, it's just different ways of telling stories. The Wing Luke Museum in Seattle is a fascinating example because it is a community museum. They actively work with different immigrant and other communities in the Seattle area to make sure that the stories being told are their stories. It's not a historian looking down and saying, this is the thing you need to know. It is them taking the opportunity to reach out to the people around them and say, what do you want to share about your story? And I've tried to bring some of those lessons here. We did a fascinating, I think, temporary exhibit a couple of years ago that's still available online if anyone is interested. Myself and our education director, Emily Kilgore, really put this together, worked with teachers in the area, with some local civil rights groups, with the Downtown Business Association, to have a community exhibit all about what people experienced during COVID. We tied that to the Wilson period by talking about the Spanish flu at the same time, that incredible pandemic. And it was a really neat experience and a very different sort of exhibit for us, where we provided the space but allowed, all the label text, all the panels on the wall, that was written by these different groups. So we had things that I would never have expected to have in the museum. We had, I think it was the Polynesian sauce that's from Cookout. That was a student who had said, the very first time I got to see my friends again, we all went to Cookout with masks on, and then we sat and ate in the parking lot. There was a student who was hard of hearing, and so she had a very special mask that had a plastic window in the front, so that she would have ask people to wear a mask like it, so that she could see and read their lips. It allowed her to communicate while being safe at this time. We had the floods in downtown Staunton washed away a lot of things that from various businesses. One of which was one of those sandwich boards that got found in a a farmer's field miles downriver. And so we were able to show that all muddy, as well as posters and photographs from the George Floyd rally that was held in Gypsy Hill Park in June of 2020. So it was a cool exhibit, and one that was very different for us, and one that we are looking forward to doing things like it again.
Yeah, you must have seen some changes in the work that you do before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And
just a little bit.
After, yes, I'm sure. What are some big successes that came out of that adversity for the museum?
Well, I mean, like everybody else, we closed down for totally for several months. And we tried to do all we could to move online. We put together a lot of, we call them history at home programs. We was 30 to 45 minute programs all about what different aspects of the historical period. The one I did the most, that was requested, I guess, the most was about the Spanish flu. And we can make some direct comparisons to what we, at the time, were still living with. I guess we still are today. But myself and our director of education, Emily, I think it was almost close to 90 programs, individual new programs that we made at that time. We were giving them a couple times a week. And a lot of them are still available online. So if anyone is interested in those topics, then I encourage you to look them up. But it was a tough time, and we were very lucky as well to get a number of the sort of emergency grants that were out there to help us, if not open the doors, but at least keep everybody employed until we could open the doors again. We used it as a time to do a lot of planning and think about how can we tell these stories better? How can we be more open and engaging? And how can we move beyond a story of one specific man and into a more holistic view of that time? Focus on not just one guy who was a baby here and went on to be president, but on others who are being affected by his policies and who are working to affect history in their own ways. So we're really excited about what the future holds.
Yes, and you are incorporating some of those programs too within the exhibits now.
We are.
Like at the Peace Arrow exhibit with the Woodrow Wilson's limousine. Mm-hmm. You have a little program, you can QR code it, and it takes you to a bit of a history about that particular car, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much history. Yeah. If we put it all on the panels, you're sitting there for a long time trying to read it all. It's a little bit more engaging if you get to like listen to somebody talk about it, and maybe you can go about your day or be folding laundry or cooking or something while it's happening. That's sort of our goal.
Yeah, I think that makes it a lot more fun to come here. And it has to be not all, bed of roses doing this job. I'm sure there are challenges that come with preserving the pieces of work here, the artifacts, the history. One thing you told me I did not know is when a new artifact comes in, it goes in the freezer for a couple of months.
Yeah, we are very lucky. Woodrow Wilson had sheep on the White House lawn.
Yeah.
Our museum mascot, Wooly Wilson, is a sheep, sort of cartoony sheep, based upon them. And we, just a few years ago, we received a very generous donation of some actual wool from those sheep. And it was raw wool, not treated, not cleaned. And it came to us in a box. It had been sitting, I believe, in a bank vault for a very long time. And with something like that, we want to make sure we're not accidentally introducing molds or pests or who knows what into the rest of the collection. So we have a freezer in the basement of our museum that we'd never put food in. It is only for collection objects like that one. And the wool went in there carefully wrapped. I think it was in there 3 or 4 months. We try to keep it in a long time to ensure that anything coming in is not going to potentially infect the rest of the collection. We don't want to actually accidentally bring in some moths and then all of a sudden all our textiles are gone. Mm-hmm. So we try to be very careful about things like that. And the wool is on display now. It doesn't look any cleaner. It certainly doesn't, but I am assured that there are no molds or pests in it to get through and into anything else.
What other processes do you all have to go through to preserve historical facts around here or historical artifacts?
It really depends upon the object and what's going on with it. Our sort of goal here is stability, more so than like trying to make something look like new. If we get a helmet from World War I and we have a German one that has a bullet hole in it, we don't want to hammer that out and fix it so that it looks like a brand new helmet. That's a part of that story. So when we get clothing in, silk is a good example that if it's not cared for well, once it starts to deteriorate, there's not really a lot you can do without an immense amount of money, like just a crazy amount of money. And we are a poor museum and can't do that. So we do what we can to stabilize these items so that they can be shown to the public, but also preserved as long as we possibly can. We do a lot of rotation of objects. So we have, talking about Ellen's paintings as an example, we have, again, about 15 of them. We don't have them all on display at once and then just permanently. We have them out for a little bit and then they are in storage for a little bit. This gives them a chance to rest so they're not exposed to more than necessary, changes in temperature or humidity. There's not really anything we can do. If they are on display, there's going to be changes in temperature. There's going to be humidity from just people walking around and breathing. We certainly don't want people to come here and be told not to breathe. I don't think we get a lot of guests. But this sort of rotation allows us to preserve them for much longer than if they were just permanently on the wall.
Yeah, you have artifacts too in the library as well. Who has access to the library? What kind of research happens in there? Who is your typical type of visitor for that library?
Well, that is an excellent question. We are a presidential library, but I'll also take this opportunity to say that we are not a federal presidential library. The sort of system that we think of now, where a U.S. president leaves office, starts raising money and builds a library, and then they turn that over to the National Archives and Records Administration to run it, and then they fill it with all the official presidential papers. That's not the case here. That law that was passed was done in the 1950s, and Herbert Hoover and Harry Truman were both still alive, and they didn't want to insult them. And FDR had already started building a library for himself in New York. So they got grandfathered in. But any president prior to Herbert Hoover, and that includes the unimportant ones like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson.
Unimportant ones. Okay.
If they have presidential libraries, and several of them do, not all, but they are either private foundations like we are, or they are run by their states. The Lincoln Library is a good example, is run by the state of Illinois. And we do not have all of Wilson's official presidential papers. Mm-hmm. Those are still stored at the Library of Congress and available to researchers, and a lot of them are online. But we, not probably too surprisingly, the Library of Congress is not, they don't just give their stuff away. So they will stay there permanently. But what we have are a lot of papers of people around Woodrow Wilson. We have some from him for sure, but some of the most important collections are those that relate to his daughters and their families, to a couple of his cabinet secretaries, and our largest single collection is from a man named Cary Grayson. He was Woodrow Wilson's presidential physician through the entirety of the presidency, and indeed until Wilson's death in 1924. And he became a close personal friend and confidant of Woodrow Wilson. He is a fascinating figure, and one who, because he has an official role, official sort of government role, but not necessarily a administrative or even diplomatic one, he is present at a lot of these incredibly important points in history, but doesn't have to worry too much about offending, I suppose. And by that I mean in the Paris Peace Conference. Again, Woodrow Wilson is there for almost 6 months. Hard to imagine a U.S. president just being out of town for that long. But Wilson is in Europe for almost 6 months, and Dr. Grayson keeps this incredibly detailed diary. And again, because he doesn't have this sort of diplomatic post, he can be fairly honest about the things that he hears, the things that Wilson says, because he is not expected to be like turning over his papers to the Department of State or something. And so his diary is one small part of this incredible Grayson collection that we have in our archive. The library is open for special tours. We try to tell people that our archives building is not just the library. The whole thing is the presidential library. And that if you went into the archive, you're seeing a bunch of boxes. It's not as exciting as people tend to think. But we do make it available for researchers. And we have had people who have gotten Pulitzers, and we have had middle school students come. I mean, we want it to be open to everyone. We just have, because of care of those collections, we have that done by appointment. But we have special spaces set aside for researchers. And we are also working to make as much as we can available online for free and fully transcribed so that you can search it at your leisure. And again, not having to leave your home to do so.
Well, that's pretty extensive, although I will say it's very impressive to see it in person, looking at all of these old books. We offer those as special tours. So if anyone is interested in a behind-the-scenes tour, the library is definitely a part of that. All right. And you have a series now, too, I noticed when I was checking out your website, called Reckoning U.S. Presidents and Racial Inequality. It says it's a, quote, a series that explores the views and political policies of individual presidents toward minority populations with an in-depth focus on how each of these minority groups was affected by presidential policies directed toward them, end quote. There's a monthly Zoom in where you can listen to this special lecture series. Can you talk more about that?
That was a project that really came. So a few years ago, there was a directive that came from the administration at the time that said American federal government controlled presidential sites are not supposed to be talking about race. That this is not something we need to be dealing with. You're just supposed to talk about the history. Don't talk about race. I'm not sure how they said, how can you talk about history and not be talking about race relations in the United States? But that's a different issue. But we, because we are not federal, we saw this as an opportunity to talk about these difficult subjects, but incredibly important ones. And so if anyone is interested, that series went in 2022, went throughout the year. We ultimately did, I believe it was 9 programs, and we worked with presidential sites across the country, looking at presidents you don't perhaps think about so much when it comes to some of these issues. And we've decided to focus not so much on the founders. We feel like that first sort of generation of American presidents, they get a lot of attention already. So we started with Andrew Jackson, and we worked with educators and historians at these different sites. The Jackson Library, the Grant Library, the Harrison and Hayes presidential sites, the Harding presidential site, the Lincoln Library. And we had these great conversations with their staff and historians about how we should be talking about these presidents and race. And there are ones like Lincoln where it's not too surprising. He gets a lot of praise, and rightly so, for helping to end chattel slavery in the United States. But we wanted it to be more holistic than that. So we also talked about his policies when it came to Native Americans. We did our Woodrow Wilson program. Of course, we had to include Woodrow Wilson, and talked with some great historians about that period, talking about, again, the intense failures of things like segregation, as well as the times when he is focusing on uplifting Jewish Americans, especially. The complexity of every American president is an important part of that story. And all of those are available for free. It's presidentsandrace.org. We did that as that was a part of a grant. And so that is going to be up there and available in perpetuity. And we are hoping to continue that story. We only did, again, 8 different presidents, I believe. There are certainly more presidents than that. And so we look forward to expanding that in the future.
I look forward to that too. There's so many things I want to look up more about after this. And looking ahead, speaking of future, what are some exciting developments or initiatives that visitors can look forward to at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library in the coming years?
Well, that is a big question. We are working to completely renovate our museum. We want to tell the story as best we can. A lot of our current exhibits, not all of them, but the majority, are kind of old. They're from when they were installed in 1990 and are due for not just a facelift, but just a whole body makeover, perhaps. And we are working with scholars and students and teachers and our community to figure out the best way to tell those stories, to tell the right stories, and to broadly do a better job of talking about this consequential figure and this transformational era. Our goals are to complete that project in the next few years. And it's something we've been working on since 2019 and been thinking about for far longer than that. So it's a long process and not a quick one, but we are looking forward to the big changes that are coming in the next couple of years.
I'm looking forward to that too. I feel like you've done some of that already where you've kind of upgrading exhibits a bit, right?
We've our trench exhibit is fairly new. The Pierce Arrows garage was redone just a few years ago. So we've been doing it piecemeal, but we want to take this opportunity to get it done in one fell swoop and really improve the whole experience.
Speaking of which, people can support these efforts by coming to take a tour. They can volunteer, I imagine, and
absolutely
they can donate, I imagine.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Yeah, and then there's a membership too. What's the membership about?
We call it our League of Friends after the League of Nations. I
like that.
That gives you free access as much as you want during the year to the museum. We have discounted rates on a number of our some of the programs that we offer. We try to give a lot do a lot of programs that are free, but those that we do charge for, then you would get a discount rate. You also get access to the full library of all of those History at Home programs that we put together. And those are everything from race in Wilson's administration to the Pierce Arrow limousine to the art of Ellen Wilson to gardening in Victorian America. We try to do a lot of different topics, and there's something for everybody in there. So you would get full access to that library as well.
Right. So they would have, instead of paying, $20 for every tour, they could come as much as they wanted throughout the year with the membership.
Yep.
And then if there's extra cost, then that's when they get a discount and all of that.
Definitely.
That's pretty exciting. I think there's some, especially if you're a researcher and you love history, that is definitely worth your membership because there's so much available to people that are into that kind of thing.
And I will say just that if you're a researcher, coming and doing research in the library is absolutely free. Our goal is openness, transparency, and accessibility. So if you want to come and then take a tour, we might charge you for a ticket. But if you are interested in that history and know the documents that you want to see, setting up an appointment is absolutely free.
Excellent. So now, lastly, as we wrap up here, how best can our laughers stay updated with you and the library, this museum, on social media and otherwise?
The best way is our website, which is woodrowwilson.org. But we're also on social media. And the best way to do that is through our mascot, Wooly Wilson. He has Twitter or X, whatever it's called now. And that is Wooly_Wilson. And it's WOOLLY. And his Instagram is at WoolyWWPLM. And you can follow him there. We announce upcoming events. We talk about just fun facts from history. When we get new collections donated, he is usually our spokesperson, I suppose, our announcer for things like that. So there's a lot going on there. And our director of education, Emily, does a fantastic job with that.
Great.
It's hard for him to type with hooves,
I imagine it is. So we will type for him and put that information for you all, the laughers, in the show notes as well. So if you are driving or working out, never fear. We have got that right there in the show notes for you. And thank you so much, Andrew. This has been delightful and super informative chatting with you today about all things Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Museum. Thanks for coming on the show.
This was so much fun. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I loved it. And I will be back. Laughers, there's so much to see and learn in this museum, taking a tour, doing some research, exploring their exhibits, coming to an event, supporting them, donating, or volunteering. Visit their website today at woodrowwilson.org. That's woodrowwilson.org, and get more information today. Also, don't forget that discount on PrePOPsterous using promo code LAUGH15 at PrePOPsterous.com. That way you can munch on it when you join me on next week's episode. And lastly, and most importantly, thanks for tuning in, Laughers. Out of all the podcasts out there, you picked us, and we think that's pretty darn special, just like you. Until next time, keep smiling. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Virginia is for Laughers podcast, brought to you by X2 Comedy. We'll be dropping a new podcast every Wednesday, so check back for another uplifting episode. Come to an X2 Comedy show or let us bring one to you. To find out more, head to x2comedy.com. Be sure to share this podcast with a friend, and until next time, cheers.